Let me get my script. Our presenter today is well known by most of you. Everett Thomas came to Goshen College from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He met Barbara Gundon at GC on his first day there, and they've been married for 53 years. They are the happy, not proud, parents of a son and a daughter and 2 grandsons. In addition to graduating from Goshen College, Everett also earned a Master of Divinity at AMBS. To describe in detail Everett's career and activities would take up most of the remaining class time. He has been, among other things, a butcher, teacher, chaplain, writer, editor, elected official, fundraiser, theater renovation manager, sailor, and musician. He has also served as the CMC board chair. Everett, we look forward to hearing your life story.
Thank you, Mark. I've been told that somebody here thinks I'm too young to have a cane. So to explain why I'm using a cane, I had a fall a couple of months ago, ended up with fractures in 2 vertebrae. And when I talked to Paul Bowler, he only said was, ouch. And so we just let him heal back up, I guess. I did have a bone marrow biopsy, which was very painful. We're trying to rule out multiple myeloma, which is what my older brother died with. And I also have had a full body bone scan. And when I shared it with Max Mertz, he said, 28 x-rays, why aren't you glowing in the dark? So Dr. Bowler says, well, just don't get too close to a Geiger counter. So I am the second of 6 kids born to Leon and Jean Thomas of not Lancaster, but Lancaster. That's right. Rhymes with gangster. And mom and dad met when dad was in CPS. He was in 4 locations. He was in Luray, Virginia, Goshen with the meat packers. He was running meat packing, being a butcher. And then Kelowna, where he stayed with Thomas and Ruth Miller, who had Jean. And eventually mom moved to Lancaster and was a school teacher there until other kids came along. I'm not quite sure why, but I ended up with a passion for congregational life in the Mennonite Church. None of my other 5 siblings have remained with the Mennonite Church, although my older brother was active in a sort of Pentecostal congregation in Lancaster. And my sister Gretchen, who's still living in Lancaster, is very active in the St. James Episcopal Church. But I think maybe there were a couple of things that happened in my childhood that led to my passion for congregational life. We were at a little mission church in the worst part of town. It's called the 7th Ward. It was a ghetto. And Vine Street Mission. And once a month we had children's church as our favorite time because there was no sermon. And instead, the Sunday school superintendent would do a Bible quiz. And I was probably 10 or 12 years old. And one Sunday during the Bible quiz, he said, now this question is for the adults. Children are not going to know this answer. Who is it that says ha ha in the battle? I put my hand up and I said, the horse. And my older brother starts snickering at me. And the Sunday school superintendent says, he's right. It's from Job chapter 39. You might want to read that sometime. It's a really interesting chapter. Yahweh God spends a lot of time sort of making fun of humans. It says, the horse paws the ground in the valley, prances proudly, charges at battle weapons, laughs at fear unafraid. When I was about 14, for some reason, never quite knew why, my dad decided we should leave Lancaster Conference and go to Nessville, Mennonite Church, a big progressive church that was much more liberal. The women did not wear coverings, they wore makeup, they wore earrings. I was fearful for my salvation at 14, if we're going to go to this worldly church. And so I eventually got over it. Something else happened in my teenage years that was also quite formative for me. My father had two cousins who were also meat cutters. John Thomas did chicken primarily. Our family did mostly pork. And David Thomas did beef. And we had our three stands near each other. We were right next to David's beef stand, across the hall from John Thomas's chicken stand. And if you've been to Lancaster County and you ever visit Willow Valley, that would be John Thomas' family that did that. In 1965, I think it was, Lancaster Conference called David Thomas, my father's cousin, to be the moderator of Lancaster Conference. That was going to be a full-time job. And that meant you didn't have to work in the butcher shop. In fact, I was amazed at the idea that you could work for the church and get paid. Well, as it turned out, then I worked for the church most of my life and got paid. Anyway, when David sold beef, he quit butchering, so my dad got into beef as well as pork and lamb and veal. The idea of having that kind of world to live in was amazing to me, to be able to work for the church. And then in 1969, I graduated from high school in 68. I stayed around for a year, basically running the meat store, but I wanted to sort of escape. I had two friends from Nashville, Dennis Landis, you may know his wife, Susan Mark Landis, might know that name, and Gary Rohr were my friends from MOF, and Dennis and Susan live here in Goshen now. I saw in the Mennonite Weekly Review, the MCC was having this study tour to the Middle East. This was 1969, 2 years after the, 6-Day War. And I told my mother I would like to go because they're making a big deal out of it being intergenerational. So my mother calls Akron and they tell her that, sorry, it's full. We've got all the people we're going to take along. Well, you had to know my mother. She loved to, when he says yes, she loved to host what we called then the MCC trainees fresh off the boat when they came from Europe, because she wanted to treat them to sweet corn. Europeans didn't eat sweet corn, and they called it shrine food. And so every summer, we would get all these trainees coming to our place, and she would just get such a big kick out of watching them turn their noses up. Then they take a bite, and it's like, oh my goodness, this is really good. Anyway, she reminded whoever it was at Akron that she had been providing this picnic for a number of years. So the least they could do is take me on this petty tour. So I did. In 1969, I had never been any place except Kelowna. You can imagine the way that trip blew my world apart. First, we went to Rome, and then we flew from there to Egypt, Amman, flew from there to Jordan to visit the refugee camps, to Beirut, and then we had to leave, we had to fly to some island out in the Mediterranean and fly back into Israel. We were in Israel for 10 days, 5 days in Jerusalem, and then came back to Greece. You cannot imagine what that did to my worldview. And about a month later, in the summer, I was cutting up one more quarter of beef, and I thought, this is boring. And so my friend Dennis Landis kept pestering me to transfer to Goshen College. So I got on the phone and I called a guy by the name of John Zook. And I thought, oh, John Zook, that's a good Lancaster County name. I didn't know this was Missouri. But he said, "Yeah, just come on out and bring your transcript." So I did. Packed one suitcase, took my guitar, caught a ride with Jerry Stoltzfus, who later married my first cousin. They go to 8th Street. And as Mark said, Ocean College, and they still do this, used to have a chicken barbecue on the first day for the students. And Dennis and Gary, my buddies, were walking out. They had gotten to know Barbara really well and did a lot of joking around. And so Dennis says to Barbara, why don't you meet our friend Everett? And she said, well, he's like, you don't want to meet him. And then she turned to me and said, she was passing on a chicken, and she said, "You want a neck?" That's not true. She hates it when I tell that story. It's somewhat apocryphal. Anyway, went to Goshen College, went to Korea, SST, and then we got married in '72, and we were very fortunate, given the job market at that time, for Barbara to get a job at Waterford Elementary School, where she taught first grade for 38 years. And I was hired at Bethany right next door as an English teacher. And while at Bethany in the first year, I had a prep period the same time as Irene Gross. And so we're sitting there in the teacher's lounge, and I thought, well, I need to get to know some of my colleagues. And I knew that she came from Europe. And I asked her if she had been an MCC trainee, as we call them. She said, yeah. I said, well, what year did you come over? She said, 1953. Do you remember a young family when you had your picnic, eating sweet corn for the first time? Oh, yeah. Did you remember any of the kids? Yeah. There were some young kids there. I said, well, I was 3 years old. We were playing together. Irene and I were playing together when I was 3 years old. We were going, after we got married, we came here to College Church as a young couple. And after about, I think the second or third year we were here, Phil Clemens, who was very convincing, talked me into playing my trombone with somebody's going to play trumpet. We're going to do a brass fanfare. It's probably Easter. I hadn't played my horn since high school. And if you know anything about playing a musical instrument, your muscle tone is called embouchure. I had no embouchure, no muscle strength. And so I did the best I could and did a little squeaking and squawking. But afterwards, somebody came up to me, and I'm not going to name names because he's no longer living, I don't think, but Everett, he said, I really like brass, but I like clean brass. Well, I was humiliated. And by that time, I was ready to attend a small church like I had grown up with Pine Street. So we went to Walnut Hill, and we were there for about 15 years. Had a lot of different roles there, and especially for Barbara, that was wonderful. I mean, she grew up in College Church, but at one point, I think it was 1998, nearly years ago, is that 30? We came back to College Church because of all the Gunton relatives who were here. And that meant, I think there were something like 7 or 8 uncles and aunts and cousins here. And we never connected with them unless Barbara called her mother in Florida to find out what was going on with her relatives. But 5 years into teaching English at Bethany, I developed kind of a crisis of faith. And I decided, since I'm teaching at a Christian high school, I really should not be a teacher here. In '76, we adopted our son Matthew, who was 4 days old. Dr. Willard Crable was the person that did the private adoption. So I stayed home while Barbara went back to work. And of course, she made more money than I did teaching in Bethany. And so in the fall of '77, while I had this toddler, I decided to take a class at AMBS, one class. And I decided if I was going to go to seminary, I should start with the languages. And if I was going to start with languages, I start with the first language, which was Hebrew. So I signed up for this course, and I was frightened. by Miller Lind. And I came home that day thinking, I don't know that I can do this. I'm not sure I'm smart enough to do this. And then I thought, well, wait a second. These other people are doing this too. I can handle it. It turned out to be life-saving for me. It was the beginning of what I would call reconstructing an adult faith. And I fell in love with Hebrew. I fell in love with Miller Lind. One of my last conversations with Miller was, Miller, these things that you taught me in that class have been so important to me. And he said, well, somebody taught me them. Very just, not just sort of self-effacing. That was the year that Devon Schrock had a farm accident, broke his pelvis, and Bill Hooley had hired me to write some news releases about Bethany, and so he called me. He wanted to know if I'd come back and fill in the English class from Thanksgiving until spring break, until Devon could come back, and I did. And then he advertised the assistant principal position, hired me for that. And so then I became the assistant principal for I think that's 5 or 6 years. I was at Bethany for 15 years, first as an English teacher, then as assistant principal, and then development director, raising the money for the big new gym. It was wonderful because we were raising $3 million I'm talking about after being assistant principal, we're raising $3 million in '86 for this new gym and music room and restrooms and a lobby, snack shop. Yesterday, I went to an inflation calculator. $3 million today would be $9 million.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much pent up interest in having a gymnasium that Bill and I would go to breakfast somewhere and come back with $300,000 check. He goes to lunch with somebody else and come back with a big check. And the board said, we're not going to break ground until we have $3.1 million given or pledged. So I very carefully kept track of the pledges, and sure enough, by early '89, I decided to take everything to Stauffer. What was his first name?
Done.
Don Stauffer. And he looked it over and he went to the board and said, yep, you've got $3.1 million pledged or given. So that fall in November, we broke ground for the new gym. In church circles, I would say church organizations, if you are successful raising money, suddenly you get a lot of job offers. And in the summer of '89, I got 4 different job offers. But I need to back up just a second. When I was in seminary in the early '80s, I became good friends with Glenn Miller and Don Wise, 2 physicians from Ohio, who were on the search committee for our congregation there. And they talked me into coming out to visit their church, possibly to become the pastor. And I really wanted to be a pastor at that time. So I had Barbara and I go out there and had a wonderful time meeting with the committee, having lunch. We get home and Barbara looks at me and she says, I will not be a pastor's wife. Now, in fairness, I need to say, 15 years later, she changed her mind. And I was at that time collecting miniature church buildings because I was doing a church architecture seminar. And so she gave me a miniature church and she said, it's okay now because the kids were grown. But I was into other stuff by then. What happened when we were all in the Hill is one of the bivocational pastors, his name was Marvin Miller, took me to Dunkin' Donuts. He said, and I was taking classes at ABS. Everett, have you ever thought of being a pastor? And I was just so shocked having somebody say that to me. He called me to do that, but it didn't work out. And so after the capital campaign at Bethany, I thought, well, I can't be a pastor anywhere, so I guess I'll continue to be a Mennonite high school principal or administrator. But that time, Orville Yoder from Board of Ed was looking for a principal for Sarasota Christian School. And so we agreed to travel to Sarasota in spring break of 90, getting mixed up here, 89. And I put down Charlotte Holsopple as one of my references for them. At that time, Charlotte was chairing the board of directors for the Mennonite Board of Congregational Ministries. Now, a little background to MBCM. When I was a senior in high school, the delegate assembly in Kitchener created two new boards. One was the general board, and one was the Mennonite Board of Congregational Ministries. And as John's brother Paul Ledrock told me a couple of years after I started at NBCN, the reason they did that was to disempower Scottsdale. And he, as you might guess, Paul pretty straight with me about that. And because I was the NBCM president at that point, and I remember being cynical in college about this church continuing to build structures, and we don't need more of that. But of course, what Paul said is exactly what happened. If you go to Scottsdale now, you'll see the building is empty, and what's left is Mennonite Media in Harrisonburg. So before we made our trip to Sarasota Christian School, Charlotte called me. Everett, I would like you to come and meet our board of directors for our executive secretary position was called at that time. My response to her was, those boards are led by middle-aged holy men. Jim Lapp, Paul Gingrich, Jim Kratz, Al Meyer, were all these middle-aged holy men. I thought, I'm 30 years old. How am I going to be one of them? And Charlotte's answer was, time to change that. So I went over to Elkhart when they were having their meeting in March. We still had not been to Sarasota. And I met with them. And apparently I was just, I don't know, genuine enough or probably proud enough to talk about some things that I'd done, that they felt like I was the person for to lead at NBCM. So we went to Sarasota, and I knew the writing was on the wall because all the congregational ministries was a place would be able to feed all of my interesting congregational life, everything. And we met with the board of directors in Sarasota, and apparently they had a new policy that their principals could not have their family members working for them in the school. Well, Barbara needed a job, and this thing with Charlotte and NBCM was just too tempting. And so I turned down Sarasota Christian School. Barbara sent me some of the winter coats that she had just purchased for the kids. She'd done that before, went to Sarasota, thinking we'd go there. And Barbara's folks lived in Naples, Florida, so that was another pool for going down. But I started my work at NBCM in the fall of '89 and ended up really struggling at the beginning. In fact, I remember having to borrow money from MMA to make payroll. And I just learned recently from Del King, he was so worried about that, whether we'd ever pay that back or not. But we did, and by the time I left 11 years later, we had some really good reserves. But I had some all-stars working for the board, and I likened myself to Phil Jackson coaching the Lakers. He had all these stars playing for him, right? He just coached them. You got Dale Stolzfus and Ann Stuckey were in the ministerial leadership office, cleaned up the mess we had there, having to do with something called the list. I was told by so many people that if a pastor puts his name on the list, it's a kiss of death. So Dale and Ann did a wonderful job with that. Marlene Krupp was providing resources for congregational worship. Claire Schum was our family life person. Ray Bear and Lily Bear were in stewardship. It was a wonderful team. In fact, I ran into Dale about a month ago. He came here to see Dwayne. And he said, oh, Everett, he said, those are the best years of my life. And that's exactly what Carlos says. And that's exactly what Carlos Romero, who is our youth minister. I hired Carlos as a denominational youth minister because I needed somebody that I knew was entrepreneurial, as he was principal of the Summit Hills School in, what time is it?
You got about 4 minutes.
Okay. So I called Carlos yesterday and I said, in the 10 years you were in the youth convention, what was the biggest one? And he said, oh, I think it was in Kansas City. And his first youth convention was in Eugene, Oregon, 2,200 youth and sponsors. Kansas City was 8,500.
Hmm.
And how many were there last summer? Well, I never did find out a count for how many youth and sponsors went to the gathering, but so cutting ahead, I was invited to serve as editor of the Mennonite, and that's probably a more recent thing you would know about. But I wanted to tell you about a couple of things. When I left the Mennonite, the board of directors gave me this. It is all my editorials in color, perfect bound. It's worth more to me than my kids. I asked whether the historical library would want it, and Joe said, well, we wouldn't requisition it, but we would take it. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it, but it's come in handy to try to figure out what some of the things were that I said. And then in 1995, Lauren Peachy was on the NBC board. And he was working for Everett at that point on the credit union in Scottsdale and the Megas. And we became fast friends. And so Lauren and I call ourselves spiritual partners. And we were invited by Mennonite men to write a book about our experience. So for 30 years, we've been meeting with each other once or twice a month and go over these questions with each other. First two, how have you experienced God's grace since we last talked? How have you resisted God's grace since we last talked? And we put them all in here along with the other ones that I'm not going to tell you because you'd be too curious about the answers. And they published this, and it became the first of a series called Closer Than a Brother is the series, but they didn't let us keep that title. So the title of ours is What Really Matters. I also wrote a novel during some of those years. I think I can't remember what year it was I published it, but I read John Ruth's poem about the Mennonites of southeastern Pennsylvania. And I still have a copy of it. I understand it's out of print. However, my dog literally chewed the cover, so it's not worth $100. It could be if I put it online. But I worked a number of the true things that happened in Lancaster County from John's book into this novel. Johann was the name of the eight-year-old boy who came to Lancaster County with his father, mother, and older sister. And we don't know the names of his mother or his sister, but his father's name was Adam. If you know Lancaster County, they settled in the Refton area, south of the town of Willow Street. And the book is basically, it's in the library here, it's basically the coming of age of this Johann, who by the time he was a teenager driving the horse and wagon, was in the army driving his wagon for the trip to Pittsburgh, where they were putting down this whiskey rebellion.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that story? One final word about my time at the Mennonite. I was really interested in being able to publish the story about John Howard Yoder's relations along the way. But whenever I tried to ask about that by anybody that was involved, very tight-lipped.
Yeah.
And so I was hoping that I could have some kind of break that loose somehow before I left the Mennonite. Well, Gordon Hauser, my book editor, wrote an article recommending a new compilation of John Howard Yoder's writings put out by Mennonite Media, I guess it was. And a woman in Harrisonburg wrote me a really nasty letter to the editor of why we would be promoting John Howard Yoder's book. Well, that opened the doors for us to talk about it. People started coming forward. And then, of course, eventually Rachel Waltner-Gosen did the major expose in NQR. If you've not read it, it's a well-researched piece. And it was finally, the story was finally out. I'm gonna stop there before Mark was on his hook.
Any questions for Everett, or comments? Or contradictions?
Corrections.
Yeah, it's your time. Okay, Phyllis.
Well, the only thing I have to say is that is about your last subject. We lived next door to his widow, Annie Yoder, and realized how devastating it was for her as his wife.
Yeah.
It would have been interesting to hear about your involvement in Goshen with the political system, because you did some good work.
I said I worked for the church most of all my life, except that wasn't working for the church. 24 years in the city council. And when I started, Main Street was in sad shape, a lot of store windows boarded up. And Mike Puro and Alan Kaufman brought it back with the help of somebody like Dave Pottinger. And by the time I left, and the civility of the Goshen City Council was pretty rough at that time. There were a couple of self-appointed watchdogs who were out to get Mike Puro. And there were some ugly things happening on the city council between council members. I remember when Patty Morgan was elected, well, the first time she was there, she said something, and I'm gonna use the name Melchior, who was a former county cop, was sitting beside me. We sat up alphabetical by last name. He reamed her out for what she had to say. And I said, I'd like to remind Councilman Troyer that our bylaws do not permit us to impugn each other's motives. Well, Mel was dying. He was smoking a pack of cigarettes, I think, every hour. And he had one rolled up in his short sleeve. And the next month I came back and he's sitting there sucking on his oxygen. You ever talk to me like that again, I'll beat you within an inch of your life. Well, it didn't happen. I had more than one person want to pay me $20 to stick my chair on his oxygen tube. But it was a wondrous experience, and of course we know what Ghost is like today. I talked to two different reporters who were there covering the Arts Board and our board, and toward the end, both of them would say the difference between the Elkhart Board's culture and the Goshen civility was just night and day. And it has stayed that way, even though we have some new people there. Thanks for asking.
Everett, I worked with the Mennonite Commission for Christian Education in Scottsdale as church-wide youth secretary. And I was there during the transition to the Mennonite Board of Congregational Ministries, which Ross Bender wanted to bring to Goshen. So I had to decide whether to stay in Scottsdale because Lauren Beachy and I worked together with the With magazine. But we decided to move to Goshen because traveling back and forth between Goshen and Scottsdale would not be a good thing. So I was with the Board of Congregational Ministries until 1970. So I know about that transition.
Would you concur with Paul Letterock's ideas about why that was done?
Let's see, say that again. Oh, you got Scott?
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that before, but that sounds like Paul Letterock. Uh, Dixie Robinson. She was a very controversial person. She used to write a lot of editorials in the paper. And I knew her quite well. I used to have breakfast with her every day except Sunday for about 10 or 15 years. We became good friends. I knew her quite well. And I knew you a little bit from over the years. And according to her, you and she became very good friends. And I knew you were on different paths than your mama. Can you tell us some of your experience with Dixie? By the way, she died. Yeah, she did quite recently. But that must be an interesting story there is how you related with her.
Well, aside from her strong convictions about all these illegals in town, as she called them,
Yes.
she was a pretty decent woman. And I know that the other Republicans would occasionally be frustrated with her because it was 4 Republicans, 3 Democrats. For example, when funding for the trolley came up, the Republicans wanted to vote it down. They didn't want to be spending money on half-empty buses going back and forth to Elkhart. And Dixie said, my people on the north side rely on that. I've got to vote for that. So, yeah, we became friends, but I had this odd way of befriending troublemakers. You remember the name Fred Buttle? Fred Buttle and I became friends. The only problem I had was he always wanted to tell me dirty jokes and I had to laugh at him. And then you might know the name Glenn Knoll. Glenn Knoll's a good friend of mine. I still see him around town, though he's in poor health right now. But I really enjoyed taking these people that would assume I would be their enemy and flipping the switch.
Paul Scott.
Paul Scott was sort of he would go his own way. And he also frustrated some of the other Republicans because he would say, well, I can go along with that when Mike Pirro or Alan Kaufman wanted to do something. I would go along with that. And of course, whenever the television crews came to town and wanted to talk to somebody from the council, they went into his barbershop. So he was quite well known.
Yeah, Everett, very interesting to hear your story. I'm curious about something else though, going sideways. Is that you lived a long arc of the Mennonite church through some of its best days. And now you look at the church today, after all of the divisions that we've had in the latter part of your life and my life. What sort of is your dream? Where's the church going in this next generation?
Well, I call it balkanized. I think the church is balkanized. And it's sad, it's heartening. But early on, when everything was falling apart, I came to the conclusion that God is responsible for the church, we're not. And I take comfort in that. I do think what is happening now is what I sort of expected. The groups are changing into groups of affinity groups. You take LMC, for example, which has Elkhart County pastor congregations in it, because people want to be with that particular kind of affinity group, and it's bigger than what Mennonite Church USA now. A quick comment about Lancaster Conference. When I was at MCM, we were doing these things called conference consultations. Everybody in them, we were required to sit down with the leadership of every conference, 21 conferences. And I really enjoyed sitting down with the leadership of the Lancaster Conference because David Thomas was still there as a retired bishop. One of the young guys one year said to him, David, why didn't you let Lancaster Conference people vote on whether or not to join Mennonite church gatherings, these assemblies? And David said, I knew that if I let conference vote, it would split us. And it didn't. It's exactly what happened when Lancaster Conference Some churches left, some stayed within the city. But I think it's these affinity groups that are very much like what the conferences, the old MC conferences were back in the day.
Everett,
To follow up on John's question, Everett, you were at College Mennonite Church, you went to Walnut Hills for a while, you've been back for about 30 years. We're in a time of change. And some of you who've been here 30 years, at one time there was 800 people in the sanctuary every morning, every Sunday morning. Now there's 200. But there's 200 online maybe. And so what's your hope or aspirations for College Mennonite Church?
Well, 10, 15 years ago, when I was chairing the worship commission, I wanted to find out who we are as a worshiping community. So I was working at Green Cross at that time, so I got out the directory, counted up all the college church households. There were residents on campus, came up with about 135. And then we were able to find out how many IP addresses were picked up with our worship service on Sunday morning. And then we had WGCS do its research. And at that time, we concluded that we had about 800 people that were part of the worshiping community, conservatively. I think it's more than 200 online. If you take all those mediums, I don't know. I pray for College Mennonite Church, and I pray for leaders. I really like Pat Venderly's leadership style. Now, I gotta tell you, it's a story on Mark. 4 or 5 years ago, I think he came to one of the first congregational meetings, and it was a kind of a tumultuous meeting. There's a lot of anger about all the people leaving. And some of you will remember that. I'm not gonna name names here, who were sort of speaking up. The next morning, I was working out in the Rinker Fitness Room, and I'm getting to know Mark. And Mark comes up to me and says, "Do you know why congregational meetings are so brutal?" Was that your word, brutal? And I said, "No, why?" "Because the stakes are so low." Well, I guess there's
a joke.
I don't know, Mark. I mean, we just keep rolling along. I do have spoken to a couple of our pastors about a trend that I worry about, and that is sending the message that we're going to be, church we're supposed to be is out there in the future. And we just have to keep working toward that. And so I sent them this poem that is posted in Dr. Paul Buller's examination rooms. Yesterday is the past. Tomorrow's the future. Today is a gift. That's why it's called the present. So let's focus on who we are now and let God's Spirit move.
One more question for Everett.
Mark, this is John Bender.
Go ahead,
And
John.
I'm chatting with you from across the pond. Thank you. And you've done well, and keep up the conversation. My question is, what do you say to the folks who don't have a chance to do a study tour?
Yeah. Yeah, that was such a gift, and it was an epiphany for me, and it was really the turning point in my life. I don't know. When I told the story of the study tour before, when I was at college, I talked about that a lot. Harold Bauman said, "We know Everett, not everybody can go on a study tour." That's true. But it was such a seminal experience for me that I have to give credit to that experience. And John, by the way, is the guy that put me up to this morning.
Yeah.
John Bender. were sitting behind us in church one Sunday, and afterward John said to me, Everett, I would like to hear your story. Okay,
Keep telling us.
thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.